The sun doesn't just rise over the Blackwood Valley, it bleeds into it. For 40 years, Arthur Vance had watched that light break over the eastern ridge, catching the silver edges of his silos and turning the morning dew on his winter wheat into something resembling broken glass. But on this morning, the frost felt different. It felt like an eviction notice. Arthur stood on the gravel turnaround, a grease-stained clipboard clutched in his chapped hands, watching the tail lights of a county cruiser disappear down Route 9. The red glow bled into the dust, leaving behind nothing but the low, rhythmic rattle of his own irrigation pumps and the bitter taste of cold coffee. Sheriff Thomas Miller hadn't even turned off his engine. He had sat in the air-conditioned cabin of his Ford F-150, looking down at Arthur through a cracked window, his eyes shielded by polarized lenses that mirrored the gray sky. When Arthur handed him the ledger, the one showing a $70,000 discrepancy between the federal grain subsidies allocated to the county and what actually arrived in his bank account, Miller hadn't read the numbers. He hadn't even taken the book. He had just looked at the dirt on Arthur's boots, shifted his toothpick from one side of his mouth to the other, and let out a low, raspy chuckle that cut deeper than any winter wind. Arthur, Miller had said, his voice dripping with the condescending pity reserved for the dying or the deeply foolish. You're a hell of a farmer. Best dryland wheat in 3 counties. But you aren't a lawyer, and you sure as hell aren't an accountant. The state computer says you got your allocation. The county ledger says you got your allocation. If your tractor's short on diesel, that's between you and the OPEC cartel, not my deputies. Go home, Arthur. Before you borrow trouble you can't afford to pay back. Now, the gravel settled. The dust cleared. Arthur looked down at the clipboard. To the rest of the world, a discrepancy in a federal agricultural subsidy program was a line item, an administrative glitch, or a boring piece of bureaucratic jargon. But to a dryland farmer running on 3-year equipment leases and variable interest operating loans, that $70,000 was the thin line between legacy and bankruptcy. It was the difference between keeping the land his grandfather cleared with an axe or watching a bank representative stick a "for sale" sign into the loam by the mailbox. He walked back toward the machine shed, his boots crunching heavily. The Blackwood Valley looked peaceful from a distance, a pastoral patchwork of deep greens and golden ambers, dotted with the rusted tin roofs of families who had bled into this dirt for generations. But underneath that peace lay a hard, unyielding geometry of power. In this county, power had a name, the Blackwood Agricultural Cooperative. It wasn't a co-op in the traditional sense, not anymore. It didn't belong to the farmers. It belonged to the board, and the board belonged to Marcus Vance, Arthur's second cousin, and a small circle of men who sat in the back booths of the diner on Tuesday mornings, deciding who got water, who got credit, and who got squeezed. Arthur pulled open the heavy sliding door of the shed. The scent of hydraulic fluid, old iron, and dry chaff hit him, a comforting smell, usually, but today it felt like an indictment. He climbed into the cab of his John Deere 8400, a machine held together by prayer, baling wire, and 20 years of mechanical intuition. As the diesel engine roared to life, coughing a plume of black smoke into the rafters, Arthur didn't see the gauges. He saw Marcus's face at the last county agricultural extension meeting. Marcus had worn a tailored sport coat over a starched western shirt, looking more like a mid-level venture capitalist than a man who had ever shoveled manure. When Arthur brought up the delayed payments from the Emergency Grain Stabilization Fund, Marcus had smiled, that wide, political smile that never reached his eyes. The wheels of government grind slow, Artie, he'd said, patting Arthur's shoulder with a manicured hand. We're just waiting on the regional clearance from the state capital. You know how the Department of Agriculture is. Just be patient. But Arthur had been patient for 9 months, while his fertilizer costs doubled and his seed supplier started sending letters certified with red ink. He had started digging. He didn't have a computer science degree, but he had 40 years of tax returns and a sharp eye for patterns. When the federal government passed the Emergency Grain Stabilization Act, it was meant to offset the export tariffs that had paralyzed small American farms. The money was routed from the U.S. Treasury, through the State Department of Agriculture, down to county-level distribution hubs. In Blackwood County, that hub was the cooperative. 3 nights ago, Arthur had sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by piles of translucent carbon copy receipts and printouts from the Federal Transparency Portal. He had found the anomaly by accident. The federal portal showed that Blackwood County had received its Tier 1 stabilization funds based on historical yield averages from 2022. The total disbursement to the county was $4.2 million. But when Arthur totaled the maximum allowable payouts for every independent farmer in the valley using the state's own statutory formula, the math didn't work. The total distributed to the actual working farms was barely $3.1 million. $1 million was gone. It hadn't evaporated. It hadn't been lost in transit. The federal system marked the transaction as disbursed and settled. It had landed in the Blackwood Cooperative's master clearing account, overseen by Marcus Vance. Audited by a local firm owned by the brother of the board chairman, and policed by Sheriff Thomas Miller, whose campaign treasurer happened to be Marcus's chief financial officer. Arthur engaged the clutch, and the massive tractor rolled out into the blinding morning light. He began his first pass across the North 40, the disc harrow tearing into the stubble behind him, turning over the dark, rich earth. To anyone watching from the highway, it looked like a man doing his chores. But inside the cab, Arthur's mind was moving faster than the diesel cylinders. He knew what happened to farmers who asked questions in places like this. They didn't get beaten up in dark alleys. It was cleaner than that. Their water rights got re-evaluated by the district board. Their grain got graded as sample grade instead of number 1 yellow at the elevator, knocking 40% off the price because of imaginary moisture issues. Their equipment insurance policies suddenly failed to renew. You didn't get broken bones, you got broken credit. But Arthur looked toward the eastern boundary of his property, where the fence line met the massive, pristine concrete walls of the Blackwood Cooperative's new state-of-the-art storage facility. The facility had been built last year, featuring automated temperature controls, high-speed rail loading docks, and a sparkling corporate office. The board had claimed it was funded through a private capital injection and a commercial bond issuance. Looking at it now, through the dust-streaked windshield of his aging tractor, Arthur realized the truth. The new facility hadn't been built with private capital. It had been built with his fertilizer money. It had been built with the neighbor's seed money. It had been built with the blood, sweat, and survival margins of 82 family farms, diverted through a labyrinth of paper derivatives and local complicity. The sheriff had laughed because the sheriff knew exactly how the machine worked. And he knew Arthur was just a single cog trying to turn backward against the gears. But as Arthur reached the end of the field and spun the heavy steering wheel to align for the next pass, his expression hardened. The sheriff thought the game was over because the local board had signed the papers. What they forgot was that federal money always leaves a digital footprint, and eventually, someone from outside the valley has to come down and count the shoes. The state office of the Auditor General does not send heroes, it sends clerks. When Evelyn Finch arrived at the Blackwood County Courthouse on the second Tuesday of October, she didn't look like an existential threat to a decade-old financial empire. She was 34 years old, wore an unpressed navy blazer from a department store chain, and carried 2 oversized canvas tote bags filled with expandable accordion folders. Her car was a base model hybrid with a dented quarter panel and a leaking windshield washer fluid reservoir. For the men who sat on the second floor of the Blackwood Agricultural Cooperative building, her arrival was treated with the same mild annoyance as a late spring frost, a nuisance, but nothing that couldn't be managed with a little local hospitality and some creative accounting. Evelyn was part of the Special Investigations Unit, a tiny, underfunded division within the state capitol whose sole mandate was verifying municipal compliance with federal pass-through grants. She didn't have a badge, a gun, or the power to arrest anyone. What she did have was a master's degree in forensic accounting, a sharp caffeine dependency, and a flawless memory for statutory subsections. She had spent the last 6 months analyzing rural infrastructure spending before a single, anonymous packet arrived on her desk in the Capitol. The packet didn't contain a dramatic confession. It contained copies of 3 municipal water bills. And he knew Arthur was just a single cog trying to turn backward against the gears. But as Arthur reached the end of the field and spun the heavy steering wheel to align for the next pass, his expression hardened. The sheriff thought the game was over because the local board had signed the papers. What they forgot was that federal money always leaves a digital footprint, and eventually, someone from outside the valley has to come down and count the shoes. The state office of the Auditor General does not send heroes, it sends clerks. When Evelyn Finch arrived at the Blackwood County Courthouse on the second Tuesday of October, she didn't look like an existential threat to a decade-old financial empire. She was 34 years old, wore an unpressed navy blazer from a department store chain, and carried 2 oversized canvas tote bags filled with expandable accordion folders. Her car was a base model hybrid with a dented quarter panel and a leaking windshield washer fluid reservoir. For the men who sat on the second floor of the Blackwood Agricultural Cooperative building, her arrival was treated with the same mild annoyance as a late spring frost, a nuisance, but nothing that couldn't be managed with a little local hospitality and some creative accounting. Evelyn was part of the Special Investigations Unit, a tiny, underfunded division within the state capitol whose sole mandate was verifying municipal compliance with federal pass-through grants. She didn't have a badge, a gun, or the power to arrest anyone. What she did have was a master's degree in forensic accounting, a sharp caffeine dependency, and a flawless memory for statutory subsections. She had spent the last 6 months analyzing rural infrastructure spending before a single, anonymous packet arrived on her desk in the Capitol. The packet didn't contain a dramatic confession. It contained copies of 3 municipal water bills, 2 commercial grain elevator receipts from the Vance family farms, and a printout of a federal bank routing transaction that had an extra digit in the sub-account code. To the untrained eye, it looked like junk mail. To Evelyn, it looked like a classic, capital expenditure diversion pipeline. Her first stop wasn't the cooperative, it was the county records office, a wood-paneled room in the basement of the courthouse that smelled of vinegar and decaying adhesive. The county clerk, a woman named Martha who had held the position since the Carter administration, didn't look up from her crossword puzzle when Evelyn displayed her state identification credential. "I need the land title registries for Township 4, ranges 12 through 15, Evelyn said, her voice flat, practiced, and entirely devoid of the defensive aggression people usually brought into local government offices. Specifically, any commercial transfers involving the Blackwood Agricultural Cooperative Board or its subsidiaries between 2022 and the present." Martha turned a page, her pen scratching against the newspaper. "Those files are archived, honey. The digital system only goes back to 2024. Anything before that is in the old vault behind the boiler room. It takes 48 hours to clear a retrieval request." Evelyn didn't blink. She reached into her tote bag, pulled out a laminated document with a gold state seal, and slid it over the counter, covering the crossword puzzle. "This is a administrative access warrant issued under State Government Code Section 12B. It bypasses local retrieval protocols for entities receiving more than $500,000 in annual state or federal matching funds. If those files aren't on this desk in 15 minutes, I call the state treasurer's office, and your county's electronic highway maintenance fund allocation gets frozen automatically at midnight. We can wait 48 hours for the paper, but your asphalt crews won't get paid on Friday." Martha looked at the gold seal, then up at Evelyn's face. The clerk's eyes dropped to the state ID card. The flat, unbothered bureaucratic indifference evaporated, replaced by a sharp, cold realization. The person standing in front of her didn't care about local politics, didn't care who Marcus Vance was, and wasn't going to be bought off with a complimentary steak dinner at the country club. 10 minutes later, Evelyn was sitting at a metal table with 4 cardboard boxes of ledger sheets, the dust settling on her dark sleeves. While Evelyn tracked the ink trails through the courthouse basement, Arthur Vance was standing in his machine shed, watching a drop of dirty motor oil pool on the concrete floor. The silence on his farm was deafening. He had finished the North 40, but his fuel supplier had refused to drop another 500 gallons of off-road diesel without a wire transfer confirmation. His line of credit at the local bank was frozen, pending annual risk reassessment, a term the loan officer had delivered while refusing to meet Arthur's eyes. The squeeze had begun exactly as Arthur knew it would. It was invisible, quiet, and completely legal on its face. A bank has the right to assess risk, an energy supplier has the right to demand cash on delivery. But the timing wasn't a coincidence. It was a message sent from the high-backed leather chairs of the cooperative boardroom: drop the questions, or we will turn off your air. The sound of gravel crunching broke the silence. Arthur didn't move toward the door. He waited, expecting Sheriff Miller's cruiser or Marcus's shiny black Cadillac. Instead, the small white hybrid pulled up to the grease-stained doors of the shed. Evelyn Finch got out, adjusted her glasses against the glare of the afternoon sun, and looked around the yard with the detached curiosity of a tax assessor. "Arthur Vance?" she asked, walking into the shade of the corrugated tin structure, her heels clicking against the stone. "Depends on who's asking," Arthur said, wiping his hands on a rag that was more grease than fabric. "My name is Finch. I'm with the office of the Auditor General," she said, leaning against the fender of an old grain truck as if she spent every afternoon in rural equipment sheds. "I spent the last 4 hours looking at your county's agricultural stabilization records. Your name comes up 32 times in the dispute logs for the 2022 emergency payouts." Arthur let out a dry, mirthless sound. "I didn't know they kept logs of complaints. The sheriff told me he threw my papers in the burn barrel." "He might have thrown his copies away," Evelyn said, pulling a yellow legal pad from her tote bag. "But when the county clerk's office files their quarterly administrative expense claims to the state to get reimbursed for paper and postage, they have to include an itemized log of all certified citizen submissions to justify the clerical overhead. Your certified letters to the sheriff's department regarding the Emergency Grain Stabilization Fund were logged by date, weight, and tracking number. Sheriff Miller claimed $24.50 from the state for processing each of your complaints. He was making a profit on ignoring you." Arthur stared at her. The sheer, petty layered nature of the corruption didn't surprise him, but the fact that this woman had found it in a postage ledger did. "The money didn't go to the fields, Miss Finch. It went into the concrete facility down by the rail line. Marcus and his crew took the federal tariff relief money, called it an internal capital reserve, and used it to collateralize the construction bonds for their new automated elevator. They're charging us 40 cents a bushel more to store our grain in a facility we paid for with our own tax relief." "I know," Evelyn said quietly. "But there's a difference between knowing something and proving it within the framework of a Title VII federal administrative audit. Right now, on paper, the cooperative is showing that the missing $1 million was spent on regional storage optimization services contracted through an independent logistics corporation called VLM Enterprises." Arthur's hand tightened around the greasy rag. "VLM, Vance, Lewis, and Miller. That's Marcus, Old Man Lewis from the Water District, and the sheriff's brother. It's a shell company. It doesn't have an office. It's just a post office box next to the hardware store." "That's what I'm here to verify," Evelyn said, looking out toward the horizon where the massive white silos of the cooperative rose like monoliths above the valley. "And tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, I'm going into their main office to ask for the invoices. I don't suppose you'd like to show me the way?" The headquarters of the Blackwood Agricultural Cooperative did not look like a place where laws were broken. Located on a manicured 2-acre lot just past the highway bypass, it was a low, modern structure of tinted glass and limestone blocks. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of lemon wax, premium leather, and the heavy, expensive air of climate-controlled prosperity. A brass plaque by the double doors listed the founding members of the original cooperative from 1954, but the original spirit of mutual aid had long been replaced by the corporate architecture of a regional monopoly. When Evelyn Finch walked through those glass doors at 9 o'clock on Wednesday morning, Arthur Vance was half a step behind her. He wore his best denim jacket, the one without the grease stains, but his presence alone felt like an act of trespass. The receptionist, a young woman whose family had lived in the valley for 3 generations, looked up from her dual-screen monitor. Her eyes widened slightly as she recognized Arthur. Then shifted with immediate, professional suspicion to the slight woman carrying 2 canvas bags. "Can I help you?" she asked, her hand hovering near the desk phone. "Evelyn Finch, State Auditor General's office," Evelyn said, not stopping at the desk but continuing toward the heavy oak door marked Administration. "I'm here to see Marcus Vance. He was notified of my arrival via the state's automated compliance portal 72 hours ago." "Wait, you can't just go back there," the receptionist started, pushing her chair back, but Evelyn's hand was already on the brass lever of the administrative suite. The room inside was expansive. A massive walnut conference table took up the center of the space, surrounded by high-backed leather chairs. At the far end, behind a desk that looked large enough to land a light aircraft on, sat Marcus Vance. He was reviewing a spreadsheet on a tablet, a silver pen balanced between his fingers. In the corner of the room, leaning against a filing cabinet with his arms crossed over his chest, was Sheriff Thomas Miller. His uniform was immaculate, the gold star on his chest catching the sharp LED lighting from the ceiling. Marcus didn't stand up. He looked up, his face settling into an expression of practiced, weary patience. "Artie," he said, ignoring Evelyn completely. "I thought we had a conversation at the extension meeting. This isn't the place to air family grievances. We have business to run." "Mr. Vance," Evelyn interrupted, her voice striking the room like a cold chisel. She dropped her canvas bags onto the walnut conference table with a heavy, satisfying thud that echoed off the glass walls. "I am not here on behalf of a family grievance. I am here representing the state's Executive Office of Administration and Budget, pursuant to a category of fiscal review of federal pass-through funds distributed under the Emergency Grain Stabilization Act." Sheriff Miller pushed himself off the filing cabinet, his boots squeaking against the polished hardwood. He took 2 steps forward, his hand resting casually on his utility belt, near his service weapon. "Miss, I don't know what kind of authority you think you have down here, but out-of-town bureaucrats don't just barge into private commercial properties without an appointment. This co-op is owned by its shareholders. And those shareholders received $4.2 million in federal taxpayer funds," Sheriff, Evelyn said, turning her head slightly to address him without dropping her eyes from Marcus. "Under State Government Code Section 14D, any entity, cooperative, private, or public, that accepts more than $100,000 in state-administered federal funds is subject to immediate, unannounced on-site document inspection during standard business hours. Refusal to comply constitutes an immediate admission of statutory noncompliance, resulting in an automatic lien against the corporation's operating assets. Now, if you want to arrest me for doing my job, you go right ahead. But your cuffs won't stop the automated data freeze that hits your county bank accounts the second my office logs a refusal of entry report." The room went completely silent except for the low hum of the building's air filtration system. Marcus Vance watched Evelyn, his silver pen frozen between his fingers. He knew the law. More importantly, he knew the people who wrote the law in the state capitol, and he knew they had left these specific provisions in the books to protect the state's credit rating from rural default. "Tom," Marcus said softly, gesturing with his hand for the sheriff to step back. Miller frowned, his jaw tightening, but he stepped back into the shadows of the corner. Marcus turned his gaze back to Evelyn, offering a thin, bloodless smile. "We have nothing to hide, Miss Finch. We welcome the state's oversight. The Blackwood Cooperative has been the backbone of this valley for 70 years. Our books are clean. What exactly is it you're looking for?" "I need the itemized ledger entries for VLM Enterprises for the fiscal years 2022 and 2023, Evelyn said, pulling a chair back and sitting down without being asked. She opened one of her accordion folders and laid out 3 separate spreadsheets. "Specifically, I want to see the performance verifications, equipment logs, and independent third-party inspection certificates for the regional storage optimization services that VLM supposedly provided to this cooperative between June and November of 2022. Marcus's smile didn't fade, but his knuckles turned white against the silver pen. "VLM is an independent subcontractor, Miss Finch. Their internal documents are their own business. We paid them for a service, they delivered it, and we filed the necessary 1099 forms with the State Revenue Department. If you have an issue with VLM's accounting, you'll have to take that up with their corporate officers. The registered corporate officer for VLM Enterprises is your brother-in-law, Marcus," Arthur spoke up, his voice gravelly and thick with years of accumulated anger. "And the mailing address is a box at the hardware store that hasn't seen a piece of freight since the store opened. You paid them $1.1 million of our grain money, and the only thing they optimized was the concrete poured for your new private rail terminal." "Artie, you're out of your depth," Marcus said, his tone dropping into a dangerous, quiet register. "That terminal allows every farmer in this valley to ship their product to the coast for 20% less than the old rail line. We built that for the future of the community." "You built it with money meant to keep our tractors running today," Arthur countered, leaning his large hands on the table, staring directly into his cousin's eyes. "You squeezed us until we couldn't buy fuel, then you used our own relief money to build a terminal that you own. So you can charge us to use it tomorrow. That's not community, Marcus. That's a racket. Evelyn didn't let the argument escalate. She tapped her pen on her yellow pad, bringing the focus back to her numbers. Mr. Vance, under federal grant tracking guidelines, when a pass-through entity subcontracts more than 50% of its grant allocation to a third party, that third party is legally defined as a subrecipient, not a vendor. Subrecipients are bound by the exact same transparency laws as you are. I don't need to go to the hardware store box. I am requesting the VLM service vouchers from your internal files right now. If those vouchers do not exist, if you cannot show me a single work order or an independent engineering sign-off for that $1 million expenditure, then this audit transitions from an administrative review to a criminal referral for grand larceny under state statute. Marcus looked at the spreadsheets laid out before him. For the first time, a small bead of sweat appeared near his temple, just below his silver-streaked hair. He looked over at Sheriff Miller, but the sheriff was looking down at his own boots. The law was no longer a local tool that could be wielded with a laugh and a toothpick, it had transformed into a cold, mechanical trap, and the teeth were starting to close. The administrative vault of the Blackwood Agricultural Cooperative was located in the rear of the building, behind a reinforced steel door that required 2 separate security codes to open. Marcus Vance had tried to delay the inspection by claiming the compliance officer who held the secondary code was out of the county on a family emergency. Evelyn Finch had simply pulled a portable folding chair from her second canvas bag, sat directly in front of the vault door, and informed him that she would remain there, without food or water, until the door opened or until the state police arrived to execute an emergency preservation order. The code was miraculously located within 20 minutes. Inside, the vault didn't contain stacks of cash or gold bars. It contained something far more valuable in the modern age, rows of gray, fireproof filing cabinets containing 70 years of local economic leverage. Every mortgage assumption, every equipment lien, every water diversion permit, and every private debt restructuring agreement that kept the valley's independent farmers on a tight leash was catalogued here. Evelyn didn't care about the history. She cared about a single green hanging folder labeled VLM Enterprises, 2022 dispersal track. When she pulled it from the drawer, the folder was remarkably thin for $1 million contract. It contained exactly 14 pages. Arthur watched over her shoulder as she laid the pages out on a small folding table inside the vault. The documents were formatted as formal invoices on heavy white bond paper, complete with a professional logo that read VLM Logistics and Asset Management. Each invoice was for a flat sum, $78,500, and each one bore a generic description of services rendered, agricultural inventory stabilization, storage efficiency calibration, and regional supply chain optimization. Look at the dates, Arthur, Evelyn whispered, her pen tracing the bottom of the sheets. The first invoice is dated June 12, 2022. The second is June 26. The third is July 10. They were generated exactly every 14 days, like clockwork. Now look at the invoice numbers. Arthur leaned in, his weathered face inches from the paper. Invoice number 001, 002, 003. They're sequential, exactly, Evelyn said, her eyes flashing with the cold satisfaction of a hunter tracking a blood trail. VLM Enterprises claims to be a regional logistics firm operating across 3 states. But their invoice numbers are consecutive over a 6-month period. That means the Blackwood Cooperative was the only customer VLM had. More importantly, OK at the signatures at the bottom of the verification line. The verification line required a signature from a cooperative representative confirming that the services had been inspected and performed according to contract specifications. The signature was a jagged, aggressive scrawl that Arthur recognized instantly, Thomas Miller. The sheriff, Arthur said, his voice dropping into a low growl. He didn't just look the other way. He was signing off on the work that never happened. He was acting as the independent compliance inspector for the board, Evelyn explained, snapping a photograph of each invoice with a secure, state-issued digital camera. Under the emergency grant guidelines, a local law enforcement official can serve as a compliance verifier for infrastructure safety. They used that loophole to bypass the state engineering requirement. They claimed the optimization services were related to county security and grain storage safety, which allowed Miller to sign a voucher without an independent engineer ever stepping foot on the property. While Evelyn was securing the digital copies, the heavy steel door of the vault clicked, swinging inward. Marcus Vance stood in the opening, flanked by a tall, balding man in a dark charcoal suit who carried a sleek leather briefcase. The man had the sharp, predatory posture of a high-priced corporate defense attorney from the state capitol. "Miss Finch," Marcus said, his voice entirely devoid of his earlier forced hospitality. "This is Harrison Vance, senior partner at Vance, Howell, and Associates, and chief legal counsel for the cooperative. I suggest you step away from those files." The attorney didn't enter the vault, he stood in the doorway, establishing his boundary. He opened his briefcase with 2 crisp clicks and pulled out a single sheet of paper bearing a red judicial stamp. "Miss Finch," Harrison Vance began, his voice a smooth, resonant baritone that had silenced dozens of county courtrooms. "This is an emergency temporary restraining order and stay of administrative inspection, signed 45 minutes ago by Judge Robert Vance of the 3rd District Circuit Court. The court finds that your unannounced administrative review constitutes an arbitrary and capricious execution of executive authority, causing irreparable harm to the commercial reputation and operational stability of the Blackwood Agricultural Cooperative." Evelyn didn't panic. She didn't even look up from her camera until she had taken the final picture of the 14th invoice. "Judge Robert Vance," she said, her voice dripping with dry academic amusement. "Let me guess. Marcus's older brother. The judge's relation to the board chairman is irrelevant under state judicial recusal statutes, as this is an emergency ex parte filing concerning an immediate constitutional question regarding private property rights," the attorney replied, his expression completely blank. "The order is clear, Miss Finch. You are commanded to immediately cease your inspection, surrender any documents or digital copies obtained while on these premises, and exit the property. If you fail to comply, Sheriff Miller is authorized under Section 5 of this order to take you into custody for criminal contempt of a lawful court instruction." Arthur stepped forward, his massive chest expanding beneath his denim jacket, positioning his body between the attorney and the small table where Evelyn's notes were laid out. "You think you can just write your own laws down here because your name's on the courthouse door? Harrison. This woman's with the state. You can't lock her out of a federal file." "We aren't locking her out forever, Arthur," Harrison said, looking at his cousin with a mixture of contempt and professional pity. "We are invoking our right to a formal administrative hearing in the Capitol, which will be scheduled in due course, likely 6 to 9 months from now. Until then, these files are sealed under court order. And as for you, Arthur, I suggest you check your mailbox when you get home. The cooperative board met in emergency session 20 minutes ago. Due to your ongoing, public hostility to the cooperative's commercial interests, your membership has been suspended for breach of bylaws, and your grain storage contracts for the upcoming harvest have been cancelled effective immediately." Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. The cancellation of his storage contract was an economic death sentence. Without access to the cooperative silos, he had nowhere to dry and store his winter wheat. No independent buyer would truck it out of the valley without a local elevator clearance, and the crop would rot in his trucks within a week of cutting. They hadn't just stopped his fuel, they had erased his harvest. Marcus Vance smiled, a slow, triumphant expression that showed far too many teeth. "Go home, Artie. Tell your bank that you don't have a market for your grain this year. Let's see how long they keep that operating loan open." Evelyn Finch slowly packed her camera into her canvas bag, zipped it shut, and stood up. She looked at Marcus, then at the attorney, and finally at Arthur, whose face had gone completely gray. "The judge signed the order, Mr. Vance," Evelyn said to the attorney, her voice remarkably calm. "And I will respect the authority of the court. We are leaving." "The digital camera, Miss Finch," Harrison Vance said, extending his hand. "The order covers all copies and representations of the sealed files." "The order covers files obtained on these premises, Counselor," Evelyn replied, pulling a small, gray plastic card from the side of her camera and dropping it into her front pocket. "But these images have already been encrypted and transmitted via secure state cellular network to the Auditor General's master cloud directory 5 minutes ago. The physical card in this camera is blank. If the sheriff wants to arrest a state official for carrying a piece of empty plastic, he can explain that to the Attorney General's Public Corruption Task Force before the evening news cycle. She grabbed her canvas bags and walked toward the vault door. Come on, Arthur. We're done here. For now. The kitchen of the Vance homestead was lit by a single, bare 60-watt bulb that hung from a frayed cord above the linoleum table. Outside, a late autumn rain had begun to fall, a cold, driving sleet that drummed against the tin roof of the porch like a barrage of small gravel. Arthur Vance sat with his elbows on the table, his head buried in his hands. The smell of old wood, fried onions, and damp wool filled the room, the smells of a house that had held his family for 80 years, and might belong to the Blackwood County Bank by the time the first snow melted. Evelyn Finch didn't sit down. She had claimed the laminate countertop next to the sink, her laptop open and balanced between a stack of vintage ceramic mixing bowls and a half-empty jar of instant coffee. The blue light from her screen cast sharp, metallic shadows across her face, emphasizing the dark circles under her eyes. They've blocked us at the state level, Arthur said, his voice muffled by his thick fingers. Robert's injunction means the state police won't touch Marcus. The Department of Agriculture will freeze the funds, sure, but that just means nobody gets paid next season. It doesn't put my $70,000 back in the account. It doesn't give me my elevator contract back. I'm done, Evelyn. By Tuesday, the bank's going to call the note on the 8400 tractor, and once they take the steel, the dirt doesn't matter anyway. Evelyn didn't stop typing. Her fingers hit the keys with a rhythmic, military precision. Your cousin Harrison is a very good regional attorney, Arthur. She said, her voice entirely flat, devoid of panic. He knows exactly how to play the state administrative system. He knows that if he files enough procedural motions, he can stretch a state audit out until you go bankrupt and I get reassigned to a municipal sewer district review in the Northern Peninsula. He's playing the clock. And he's going to win, Arthur muttered, looking up at the rain-streaked window. He's going to win the state game, Evelyn corrected, turning her laptop around so Arthur could see the screen. But he forgot that the Emergency Grain Stabilization Act wasn't funded by state revenue. The money came from a direct federal block grant issued under Title VII of the United States Code, Section 2204. And there is a specific, rarely used statutory trigger buried in the Federal Administrative Oversight Guidelines that your cousin's local judge has absolutely no jurisdiction over. Arthur squinted at the text on the screen. It was a dense wall of legal prose, peppered with small font footnotes and cross-references to federal registers. What am I looking at? It's called the Catam provision of the Federal False Claims Act, Evelyn said, pointing a pen at a highlighted paragraph. Dating back to the Civil War, it allows a private citizen, an individual with direct, non-public knowledge of a fraud committed against the federal government, to file a lawsuit on behalf of the United States Treasury. In the legal world, you become a relator. You aren't suing Marcus for your $70,000 in a county court. You are suing the Blackwood Agricultural Cooperative in the United States District Court for the Western District on behalf of the federal government for the recovery of $1.2 million in stolen federal funds. Arthur sat up straight, his brow furrowing. A federal court? That's 200 miles away in Omaha. Marcus doesn't have a brother on that bench. No, he doesn't, Evelyn said, her eyes narrowing with a sharp, cold intensity. And under the False Claims Act, once a Catam lawsuit is filed by a private citizen, the case is automatically placed under seal for 60 days. The local court isn't notified. Marcus isn't notified. The sheriff isn't notified. The file goes directly to the Civil Division of the United States Attorney's Office and the Department of Justice. They are legally required to review the evidence I gathered inside that vault. If they find the evidence credible, the federal government intervenes, meaning the Department of Justice takes over the prosecution, using the full weight of the FBI and federal grand jury subpoenas. Arthur looked from the screen back to Evelyn's face. The invoices you photographed, the VLM receipts. Is that enough for them? A set of 14 consecutive, sequentially numbered invoices paid to a shell company with no employees, signed off by a county sheriff who serves as his brother-in-law's compliance officer. Evelyn let out a short, sharp laugh that sounded like a pistol shot. Arthur, federal prosecutors live for cases this clean. It's a textbook conspiracy to defraud the United States. The moment the DOJ opens that folder, Judge Robert Vance's injunction isn't worth the paper it's printed on. A federal grand jury subpoena overrides a local circuit court stay every single time. Arthur stood up, his large frame filling the kitchen. He walked over to the counter, his boots heavy against the floorboards. "What's the catch, Evelyn?" "There's always a catch when a small man tries to pull down a big house." "The catch is the risk to you," Evelyn said softly, her tone turning serious. "Once we file this, you are exposed. The law protects whistleblowers from corporate retaliation, but federal protection doesn't stop a local bank from foreclosing if your paperwork isn't perfect. It doesn't stop Sheriff Miller from finding a broken tail light on your truck every time you leave your driveway. And if the Department of Justice decides not to intervene, if they think the dollar amount is too low for their regional caseload, the case unseals, and you are left standing alone in a federal courtroom against Marcus's corporate defense team with no money for a lawyer." Arthur looked down at his calloused hands. He thought about his grandfather, who had slept in a sod house on this very ridge through the winter of 1934 to keep the land from being reclaimed by the railroad. He thought about his father, who had gone to work in the limestone quarries during the 75s just to buy the seed for the next spring's planting. He thought about Marcus's manicured hands and the sheriff's condescending chuckle in the dust of the turnaround. "They already took my harvest, Evelyn," Arthur said, his voice dropping into a low, steady register that didn't shake. "They turned off my credit. They stopped my fuel. If I sit here and do nothing, I lose the farm by spring anyway. If I'm going down, I'm not going down because I was patient. I'm going down swinging a hammer. How do we sign the papers?" Evelyn reached into her tote bag and pulled out a thick, white document bound by a heavy blue cardstock cover, a formal, federal civil complaint she had drafted in her hotel room over the last 48 hours, leaving only the signature lines blank. "Sign here, Arthur," she said, handing him a black ink pen. "And then we drive out of this county before the sun comes up." The morning of November 14th began like any other Thursday in Blackwood County, but the air held the sharp, metallic sting of an approaching blizzard. At 8:45, Marcus Vance's black Cadillac pulled into his reserved space behind the cooperative headquarters. He stepped out, adjusting his wool overcoat, completely unaware that 80 miles to the east, four unmarked black SUVs had just crossed the county line at 65 miles per hour. Marcus walked into the administrative suite, nodding to the receptionist. He felt insulated by the local courts, completely secure behind the protective wall of his brother's injunction. Evelyn Finch had vanished 3 weeks ago, her state vehicle had been logged leaving the county, and no further administrative notices had appeared in the portal. Marcus had assumed the state had blinked. He had already begun drafting the formal foreclosure paperwork for Arthur's property through the county bank. At 9 o'clock, the glass front doors of the cooperative didn't just open, they were held open. 4 men in identical dark windbreakers stepped into the lobby. They didn't ask for a meeting. They didn't show state credentials. The man in the lead, a sharp-featured individual with a federal identification badge clipped to his lapel, walked directly past the receptionist's desk. "Sir, you can't go back there," she shouted, her voice cracked with sudden panic as she hit the intercom button. "Marcus. There are people." The door to the administrative suite swung open before she could finish. Marcus stood in the doorway, his face instantly tightening into a mask of corporate indignation. "What is the meaning of this? If this is about that state audit, my counsel has already served your department with a binding circuit court stay." The lead man stopped 2 feet from Marcus. He didn't look angry, he looked bored, with the absolute, unshakable confidence of an official backed by the supremacy clause of the United States Constitution. "Mr. Vance, my name is Special Agent Miller, no relation to your local sheriff," he said, pulling a heavy, bound document from a leather folio. "I am with the Office of the Inspector General for the United States Department of Agriculture. This is a federal search warrant issued by the United States District Court for the Western District, authorizing the immediate seizure of all financial records, electronic servers, and communication logs belonging to the Blackwood Agricultural Cooperative and VLM Enterprises." Marcus felt the color drain from his ears. "A search warrant? On what grounds? This is an independent cooperative." The warrant was issued pursuant to an active grand jury investigation into violations of Title 18, United States Code, Section 287, filing false claims against the United States government, Agent Miller interrupted, his voice echoing through the open office floor. Your local injunction applies to state administrative reviews, Mr. Vance. It does not apply to a federal criminal probe initiated by a CATAM civil action filed by a private relator. Step away from your desk, sir. My technicians are already pulling the hard drives. Behind the agent, 3 more officers walked into the room, carrying heavy plastic storage crates and electrostatic bags. One of them walked directly to the filing cabinets in the corner and began cutting the security tags with a pair of heavy wire snips. Before Marcus could speak, the double doors of the lobby opened again. Sheriff Thomas Miller walked in, his face flushed red beneath his Stetson hat, his hand resting instinctively on his holster. He had seen the black SUVs from the highway and had run 3 red lights to get to the building. What the hell is going on in my county? The sheriff barked, stepping between the federal agents and Marcus. I'm the chief law enforcement officer in this jurisdiction, and nobody executes a warrant here without my clearance. Agent Miller turned slowly, looking at the gold star on the sheriff's chest with a cold, analytical detachment. He reached into his folio again and pulled out a second, smaller document. Sheriff Miller, I was hoping you'd show up, the agent said smoothly. This is a federal grand jury subpoena commanding your immediate presence in the United States District Court in Omaha next Tuesday at 10 o'clock. You are required to bring all personal and professional banking statements for the fiscal years 2022 and 2023, specifically relating to disbursements received from VLM Enterprises. The sheriff froze. His hand dropped away from his utility belt. The absolute authority he had wielded for 15 years within the county lines evaporated in an instant. You're being named as a co-conspirator in a federal fraud scheme, Sheriff, Agent Miller added, his voice dropping into a quiet, lethal register. The Department of Justice has intervened in the CATAM suit. We have the 14 sequentially numbered invoices you signed as an independent inspector. We also have the bank records showing that 30% of each $78,000 payment to VLM was routed back into a commercial real estate LLC registered under your wife's maiden name. If you interfere with my agents right now, I won't wait for Tuesday. I'll arrest you for obstruction of justice before you can step off this carpet. The room went completely quiet. The local power structure, built over decades through family connections, local judges, and economic intimidation, shattered in less than 5 minutes against the mechanical reality of federal jurisdiction. The sheriff looked at Marcus, Marcus looked at the carpet. Neither man spoke. 2 hours later, Arthur Vance stood by the mailbox at the edge of his property, his denim jacket zipped tight against the rising wind. A white state hybrid pulled up the gravel driveway, stopping next to his old grain truck. Evelyn Finch got out, her canvas bags noticeably lighter, a small, genuine smile breaking across her face for the first time since she had arrived in the valley. They're packing up the files, Arthur, she said, leaning against the hood of her car as the first snowflakes began to dance in the air. The U.S. Attorney has frozen the cooperative's master clearing account. They've appointed a federal receiver to oversee the upcoming harvest delivery, which means your elevator contract is legally reinstated effective noon today. Marcus and the sheriff are currently meeting with their defense lawyers in the Capitol. Arthur looked across the valley toward the massive white silos of the cooperative. For 40 years, that structure had felt like a fortress that belonged to someone else, a place that took his grain, took his sweat, and gave back only what it chose to spare. Today, under the gray winter sky, it just looked like concrete. What happens to the $70,000, Evelyn? He asked quietly. Under the False Claims Act, the federal government seeks triple damages for stolen funds, Evelyn explained, her eyes bright with professional triumph. Because you filed as the relator, you are legally entitled to between 15 and 25% of the total amount recovered by the government. The settlement will cover your $70,000, pay off your equipment lease on the $8,400, and leave you enough operating capital to buy your seed cash down for the next 3 years. You won't need their line of credit anymore, Arthur. You own your dirt again. Arthur looked down at his chapped hands, then back at the small clerk from the Capitol who had dug through the postage ledgers to find $1 million fraud. He didn't say thank you. In the Blackwood Valley, men didn't have the words for that kind of gratitude. Instead, he just nodded toward the house, where the chimney was beginning to throw a thin line of blue wood smoke into the darkening sky. "The wind's coming around from the north, Miss Finch," Arthur said, his voice deep and steady. "And the kitchen's warm. Come on inside. Let's have a fresh cup of coffee."